Hello and welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of Matthew's Gospel. It's chapter 13, part 1 of 2 parts. Here's the overall outline of our study. We started with the coming of the kingdom in chapters 1 through 4, and then picking up in chapter 4, we begin our discussion of proclaiming the kingdom. This will carry us through to the middle of chapter 16. Then it'll be facing rejection, enduring the cross, and conquering death. Under the heading of proclaiming the kingdom, we've already discussed the beginning of the Galilean ministry, the Sermon on the Mount, miracles of healing. We just finished up our study of sending forth the 12, and now we'll start a discussion of discourses and the kingdom parables, this last chapter 13, 14, 15, and half of 16. Here in chapter 13, we are going to discuss quite a few things, but in this first lesson, part 1, we want to talk about the sower went out to sow, the word and the hearer, no despair, the truth and the listener, life's stern law, and man's blindness and God's purpose. Many things in parables. Let me get rid of me out of the corner here so you can see the chart. Beginning in this chapter, a turning point in Jesus' ministry is evident. He moves his teaching from the synagogues to the outdoors. At this point, he has not been banned from the synagogues, but his welcome there has become less and less. We've previously seen Jesus teach using small parables such as salt and light, birds and lilies, wise and foolish builders, the garment and the wineskins, and the children playing in the marketplace. But now he shows us he really is the true master of the short story, as we'll see in this collection of parables recounted by Matthew. Just what are the advantages of teaching via parable? Well, we'll suggest perhaps 7 of these. A parable makes truth concrete. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a short word picture is worth thousands of words. And some things are easier shown than described, such as beauty or goodness. A parable will take the listener from the here and now and lead them towards the there and then. Teaching new material must begin from a foundation of the known. The parable compels interest. It presents an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. A parable compels a man to discover the truth for himself. It does not try to do a man's thinking for him, though. By forcing a man to find the truth in a parable, it makes the truth real and fixes it in his memory. A parable conceals the truth from the spiritually lazy or blind. For those who wish to know the truth, a parable will reveal it. For those that do not want to know the truth, a parable will conceal it. A parable was meant to be spoken and not read. To receive the same impact from these parables as the first century listeners, we need to put ourselves in their shoes as best we can. And for that, I suggest that you read these parables out loud to yourself. Generally speaking, a parable will have only one main point. Remember, a parable is not an allegory where every possible detail has a meaning that must be read or studied. Parables were designed specifically to be heard. Before we get into the question of how did the sower sow, let's take a moment, get our Bibles out, turn to Matthew chapter 13, and we're going to read a little oddly in this chapter. We're going to jump around just a bit, and you'll see why when we do it. So we're going to start with 1 through 9, and then we're going to jump down and read 18 through 23, and you'll see why. That same day Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach, and he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and he sowed. Some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them, and other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil. And immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. And since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. And other seeds fell on the good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, and some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Now, let's jump to verse 18 and read 18 through 23, because Jesus is going to explain this parable. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately falls away. And as for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the word and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. And as for what was sown on the good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another case 30-fold. In Palestine, seed was generally sown by broadcasting it either by hand or allowed to dribble out of a cut bag tied on the back of a donkey. Either way, some seed would not find properly tilled ground. A right-of-way was left along each field, and over time it would become a compacted pathway. In places, the limestone rock, so common to the area, would lie immediately below the topsoil, and this is called the stony ground. Meanwhile, the thorny ground might not show itself until after the crops begin to grow. The thorn seeds were disguised under the recently tilled soil. But the good soil was deep, it was clean, it was soft, and it was a place where a seed could find nourishment and grow up unimpeded. Let's talk about the word and the hearer. The parable is aimed at hearers of the word. There are different ways to hear the word, but only one of the ways is efficient and long-lasting. Let's go through these ways. Some hearers have a shut mind. You might want to read Ephesians 4:18. Or a person might have an unteachable spirit. This spirit is the result of either pride or the fear of learning a new truth. There is the hearer who fails to think things out and to think them through. And a sudden enthusiasm rarely lasts. Christianity demands an intelligent, continuous faith. And then there's hearers that have so many interests in life that often the most important ones get crowded out. It's easy in our fast-paced lives to become too involved, too preoccupied, or too busy even to pray, too busy to study, and thus too busy to involve ourselves in the Lord's work. These secular distractions are not necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but we can say second best is always the worst enemy of the best. There is the hearer, though, whose mind is open, who is ready and willing to hear. He receives what he hears with understanding and is ready to put what he hears into action. He listens, he understands, and then he obeys. You might want to cross-reference this with Mark 4, verse 20, and Luke 8:15. Besides thinking of this passage in terms of the word and the hearer, we also want to think of it in terms of no despair. The parable is also aimed not only at those that are hearers of the word, but also at those who wish to preach the word. The disciples were bound to become discouraged in their work after Christ ascended. The parable tells the preacher that the harvest is sure and it will come. The farmer sows in confidence even when he knows that some seed will not germinate and some seasons will not produce fruit as before. The sower does not know the results of his work beforehand, and perhaps he never will know the results of his work. If you're a sower, you cannot expect quick results. The seed must be sown in patience and hope, and the harvest left to the years. Let's read a few more verses from our study. Now we want to go back and read verses 10 through 17. The disciples came and said to him, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it's not been given. For the one who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance, but from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it." Now slide down with me to verse 34 and 35. "All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable, and this was to fulfill what the prophet spoke when he said, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter what has been hidden since the foundation of the world." When we hear a verse like verse 11 and we see a word like mystery, it makes us wonder what mystery we're talking about. However, in the Greek, this word does not mean something that is dark and difficult to discover, but is technically applied to those things known by a certain group that cannot be discovered by those outside. Let's take a time out and read an interesting passage from Barclay's commentary concerning mysteries. In the time of Jesus, in both Greece and Rome, the most intense and real religion was found in what were known as the mystery religions. These religions had all a common character. They were in essence passion plays in which was told a drama, the story of some god or goddess who had lived and suffered and died and who had risen again to blessedness. The initiate was given a long course of instruction in which the inner meaning of the drama was explained to him. That course of instruction extended over months and perhaps even years. Before he was allowed finally to see the drama, he had to undergo a period of fasting and abstinence. Everything was done to work him up to a state of emotion and expectation. He was then taken to see the play. The atmosphere was carefully constructed. There was cunning lighting. There were incenses and perfumes. There were sensuous music. There was, in many cases, a noble liturgy. The drama was then played out, and it was intended to produce in the worshiper a complete identification with the God whose story was told on the stage. The worshiper was intended literally to share in the divinity's life and sufferings and death and resurrection, and therefore share in his immortality. At the end of the play, the cry of the worshiper was, "I am thou, thou art I." So when we see that in the time of Jesus, people were, especially among the Gentiles, involved in this type of religion, this so-called to be revealed religions. It helps us understand what a mystery actually is in terms of first century thinking. We'd have to say that the Lord's Supper meets the qualification of a mystery. No one knows what the Lord's Supper does unless it's explained to them by reading to them passages from the Gospels and from the epistles to describe why we take the bread and why we take the cup. Christianity can only be completely understood from the inside. Therefore, those who criticize the church from the outside do so in ignorance. Let's move on down to verse 12. More will be given to the man who has, and those that have little will lose it. Well, that doesn't sound right, does it? Not from a 21st century perspective. However, this saying is true actually in all walks of life. Which students attain more? The ones that study more? Who has retained their high school foreign language? I was thinking about that the other day. I didn't do too well in my high school foreign language. Had a B the first year, and I actually flunked the second year of my course. And I haven't retained little or any of that language. Well, why not? We say this saying, I think we said it in the last lesson. If you don't use it, you lose it, which means goodness is something that also must be cultivated. Every time we beat a temptation, we become empowered to beat the next one that comes our way. If we fail to seize an opportunity to do good, we become more liable to miss the next opportunity to do good. Life is a process of gaining more and losing more. The closer we live to Jesus, the more we will gain. The further we drift from him, then the more we actually lose. We'll finish up part 1 of our study of chapter 13 by thinking about man's blindness and God's purpose. There's no doubt about it that verses 13 through 17 are difficult verses. You might want to compare them to Mark 4, 11, and 12, and Isaiah 6, 9, and 10. Did Jesus speak in parables so that no one can understand him? Well, luckily for us, verse 34 and 35 show that Jesus did expect some to understand his teaching through the parables. And you might want to go take a moment and look at Psalm 78, 1 through 3. The words of Isaiah that Jesus quotes tells us really 3 things. They tell of the prophet's bewilderment. To Isaiah, his words were crystal clear. Why couldn't or wouldn't the listener comprehend these words? Everyone who's ever tried to teach or preach has experienced this very feeling. They also tell of a prophet's despair. Isaiah seemed to feel that his preaching was doing more harm than good. But in the end, the words of Isaiah tell of a prophet's ultimate faith. The Jews believe that literally nothing happens outside of God's will. If men refuse to listen, that is God's will. The Jews believed that every success or failure was God at work. However, the ultimate purpose of everything is good. See Romans 9 and 11. Even the Jews' rejection and crucifixion of Christ ended up being for the good. Jesus takes the words of Isaiah and uses them to encourage the disciples to remain faithful for the long haul. We need to understand this. we need to understand this idea of the long haul. God's long-range plans will leave no loose ends, and in the end, His plans will leave no failure for those that follow in His Son's footsteps. That's all we have time for this lesson. Next time we'll conclude our study of Matthew chapter 13. Please subscribe to our channel. Please like this video, leave a comment, share this link to this video with your friends and your neighbors, your loved ones, and invite them to join in with our study of the Gospel according to Matthew. Until next time, may God bless.